welcome back to the POK Podcast. My name is Jordan, and this is Dylan. Today, we're going to be talking about education spending and what it would mean if we fully funded education. So, why don't you start us off?
Yes, this is a big old doozy of a topic. It's going to have a lot of numbers in it. We're talking about education spending. By association, we kind of have to talk about taxes because that's how education is funded. And taxes for everyone is a little bit complicated, so we'll try and make it as simple as possible, but just trying to get a basic idea of what goes into spending on education, how much do we spend on education, how do we spend it, where does that money go, and how effective is it when we spend in certain places.
Right.
So to start off, let's talk about what factors are involved in funding education as a whole. So kind of just to throw out some general numbers for you, funding for education really differs depending on where you live. So it comes from three major sources. First off, it comes from state taxes or state revenue. So whatever goes into your state budget and whatever is written in their budget for education, 45% of what we spend on education comes from that. The other 45% comes from property tax. And we'll get into this in depth because property tax is, in many of people's opinion, a critical part of why we have so many discrepancies in education. And so that accounts for about 45%. Property taxes are usually collected on a district level. And then the other 10% comes from the federal government. Now, the caveat with the federal government's education spending is that they usually only spend money on schools that spend less than the national average on a per student basis. So they're really only helping out the really dire need schools.
Mm-hmm. And the total national spending for education rivals that of the federal military budget. We do actually spend quite a lot on education. It's roughly in the range of $600 billion annually. So when we compare this to other countries, we're the leaders in education spending by a huge margin. So why do we have schools that are not only underperforming, but just in terrible conditions?
Yeah, and so we'll look a little bit more into what underperforming actually means. But one of the big discrepancies, as you point out, is you have schools now and districts that are just falling apart. And for those of you who haven't heard about the teacher strikes in states like West Virginia, Colorado, Oklahoma, Arizona, Kentucky, if you actually listen to some of these teacher testimonials, they're basically saying that they have cockroaches in some of these schools, desks that are just falling apart. There's some schools that can't even keep the lights on, let alone pay for teachers.
Right.
And so you have all these operational costs that aren't being met right now. And to that note, the bulk of education spending is comprised in what's called an instructional expenditure. So an instructional expenditure covers teacher salaries.
Right.
So about 80 cents to every dollar we spend on education goes directly towards paying teachers, right? And anytime we increase spending on education, 80 cents to every dollar goes to those teachers as opposed to other programs. So
Right.
when we increase spending on teachers, the programs that often get left out, and I'm sure many of you know this already, are art programs, theater programs, athletic programs. Those are usually the ones that end up getting left out. And the money has to come from somewhere. And so whenever we do put money into education, these other programs typically don't see as much.
Mm-hmm.
But like I said before, when we're talking about education, we do have to talk a lot about taxes. And I don't know how many of you know this, but we recently had a big tax overhaul. The GOP tax overhaul did quite a bit, but we're going to focus specifically on how it affects education spending as a whole. And the way it's affected education was actually one of the bigger critiques of the tax plan to begin with. It significantly reduced what was called the SALT deduction, or state and local tax deduction. So it put a limit on this. And so these deductions, which actually accounts for a huge amount of the federal budget, allows states to raise their taxes. And when they do that, the taxpayers can write off those state and local taxes on their federal tax return. And so states can raise their taxes, but the taxpayers aren't actually paying an increased cost, if that makes any sense.
Right.
Because they'll make up that loss in their federal tax return. So by getting rid of that, it kind of puts a lot of pressure on states, because what it means now is that if you keep the tax the same without those deductions, then what's going to end up happening is you're going to end up with a double tax.
Right.
So the taxpayer is going to pay the state and local tax, and then they're not getting this deduction on their federal tax return, and so they're also going to have to pay the same federal taxes. And most taxpayers don't really want to do that, so it puts a lot of pressure on states.
No taxpayer wants to pay double tax.
Yeah, and particularly in states that have really high taxes in general, so states like California, New York, states like this are put under a lot of pressure to either change the way they collect taxes, or they're going to be double taxing their citizens, which is something they generally don't want to do. And what we've seen as a result of the tax plan, excuse me, what we've seen as a result of the tax plan in some of these high tax states, especially states that have really high property tax, because the other thing that the GOP tax overhaul did is it put a limit on property tax deductions. It capped it at $10,000, which generally will affect high earners, right, that pay massive amounts in property taxes. But what we've seen is that there's been this migration from these really high tax, high property tax states to states that don't have those as many taxes or lower taxes.
Of course, if you can afford to move to a state that doesn't have as high property taxes, that's what you're going to do.
Yeah, and especially with an aging population that doesn't want to spend their retirement money on paying taxes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we've seen this in New York, we've seen this in California, and what this means is ultimately less money for public education in particular, because all the funding for these schools generally comes from property tax and the revenue that the state can pull in that they can accommodate their state budget. So now states are having to either find a new source of revenue or completely just change the way they spend money on education.
Right.
And as we'll get into later, states are really struggling right now to do that, as many of those states are already in kind of this budget crisis. I think 30 states, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but about 30 states are in a budget shortfall. And what that basically means is that they don't no longer have enough money to keep providing the same public services that they have in the past years. So they either have to change their budget or find new sources of revenue. And we'll go into that a little bit more later. But to just kind of further bring this all back around, this doesn't mean that the GOP tax overhaul has caused a whole lot of problems for education. The problems that were already present.
They already existed.
Yeah, they were already there. The tax plan didn't really do a whole lot in the sense of harming public education. It just didn't do it a whole lot of favors.
Sure as hell didn't help it either.
And the other thing worth mentioning about this tax plan is that it expanded the 529 savings accounts program. Right. So for those of you who don't know, I didn't know about this when I was looking into it. I didn't even know that the 529 savings plan was a thing. So basically what a 529 savings account is, it's this account that you can put money into each year that's tax-free.
Right.
And originally with a 529 plan, that money was savings for college. However, with the GOP tax bill, that money can now be used for private school.
Right.
And so what this can create, or what this incentivizes, is for, in particular, middle-class parents to send their kids to private schools. And there's this notion that private schools are generally better in the sense that they have more resources, more qualified teachers, etc.
Well, and you even have the whole,
there's a prestige. Yeah, there's a prestige
that comes with it, so that makes it seem better.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of these private schools in the eyes of most parents is that they typically tailor their curriculum and their practices around what pleases parents. Mm-hmm. So really rigorous curriculum, strict guidelines and punishment practices. So if you do something bad, there's a really harsh punishment for it. They really have like a zero tolerance kind of policy in a lot of these private schools. And so what it's encouraged is this migration from some middle-class families that would have normally put their kid in public school are now sending their kids to private school. At least that's what it incentivizes.
Tax-free.
Tax-free. And there is some debate on whether or not private schools do in fact provide a better education. There's some worthwhile skepticism around the quality of private schools. But the thing here is, and one of the big premises behind the tax overhaul and this particular element of it, is that they wanted to give parents the freedom of choice to send their kid to whatever school they felt was best. And we'll talk a little bit more about this going forward as well, but we just want to get the baseline facts out of the way.
Right.
And so we'll talk a bit more about how that may impact the population of students going to public school and how that might also cause some more discrepancies and inequality in the school system.
Well, even to add to that, so you have public school, private school, and now kind of the explosion of charter schools.
This has been a thing for the last 10 years. Everyone loves charter schools.
Yeah,
It's been
and
like this bipartisan, like, ooh, every charter schools are the best thing ever.
well, and I didn't even know that much about them until we started researching this topic, but I do remember being in high school and like the hype around, oh, we have a charter school now and you can apply to it. And it's super special. It's like, okay, well, why? What makes it so much better? Um, and so explosion of public schools, but in short, charter schools are a public institution in the sense that tax dollars are allocated to them the same way that they're allocated to public schools. But they can also take private donations, whereas public schools are not allowed.
You would get a conflict of interest for
Yeah,
public schools.
because the money would be associated with, oh, you're trying to have your influence happen in this public school and it's a government institution. So you can't donate to public schools fiscally. Um, they are legally determined to be state schools, charter schools are. However, there's quite a bit of debate on whether they should be considered private schools or public schools. The issue with charter schools is that it affects the amount of money that public schools get, because they receive the same tax dollars, or they receive tax dollars in the same way that public schools receive tax dollars. But every time we give money to a charter school, we are taking money away from a public school. In many instances, public schools that very much need that tax revenue.
Yeah, and maybe just to may address some of the way that the charter schools are typically looked at. When you look at the critics and their views of charter schools, they typically say things like, "Oh, it takes money away from the private or public schools."
Right.
It might be a little bit of a misconception to say that they're directly taking money away. So if you think
Right.
about it this way, right, is that charter schools and public schools are taking money from the same pot of money, right? And the more schools you have, the more people you have to distribute that money out to,
Right.
which means everyone gets
The
a little bit
portions get
less,
smaller and smaller.
right? However, the caveat here is that many charter schools can afford to take less from public donate or from public tax money because they can also get private tax dollars, and now, or sorry, not private tax dollars, private donations. And so now that creates a little bit of a conflict of interest problem here, where there's very little regulations on how they can spend that money,
Right.
particularly the private donations bit. And so overall, what you see is that charter schools tend to receive more money holistically if you put in tax dollars and the private donations. A lot of these schools end up having far more resources than your average public school. And the other thing is that the people that generally are the ones responsible for building these schools. So there's like Kanye West, for example, has created a charter school. You have celebrities all over the place that create charter schools
Or that endorse charter
or that
schools.
endorse charter schools, and it very much pushes this perception that these charter schools are prestigious, that they are, have all these great, qualified teachers. And what studies have actually shown is that the teachers at charter schools actually tend to be less qualified than the teachers that work at public schools.
Well, yeah, I mean there's a John Aller episode that we'll link down below that breaks down charter schools if you want to know more about them. But basically, the way that charter schools are run with this kind of hands off from government approach allows for a lot of problems and embezzlement and
Corruption, yeah.
corruption in general.
There's
Yeah.
very little oversight, and so there's a lot of opportunity for corruption in these types of systems. And there's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest that they are inherently better or even better or worse than a public school. However, one could argue that because of the lack of regulations around these types of schools, even though they don't perform necessarily better or worse than a public school, there's a higher risk of corruption.
Right.
And in that case,
It's much easier.
there's a higher risk of misspending and wasting money. And on that note, a kind of one of the bigger questions of this podcast that we want to talk about is, does more spending equal better education? And this is a really complicated answer. But to try and break it down a little bit, we kind of have to decide what better education is. What are the desired outcomes of education? And this is a really important question to ask when you talk about how we evaluate and how we standardize education. What is a good education? What are the outcomes? What are the life outcomes associated with a good education? And then the second question is, where do we need to spend the money? How do we spend money efficiently on education such that we see positive results? And for that second question, we do actually have a decent answer to it. So what we have found is there's a study, and we'll put the link to the study. There's a study done by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And what they found is that education spending, or spending more in schools, when you're looking at low socioeconomic status schools, so poor district schools,
Right.
when you pump money into those schools, what they found were some rather positive outcomes.
Right.
Instead of measuring their test scores, which we will go into thoroughly, so instead of measuring test scores, they measured life outcomes. They did a longitudinal studies. They looked at the same group of students over time and said, okay, when we put more money into education into these particular schools, what happened to these students versus students in maybe the more rich districts?
Right.
And what they found is that in these poor districts, they saw that the kids were at, I don't remember the percentages off the top of my head, but it correlated with higher wages, a decreased risk of poverty, more years of school completed. So they continued on with their education, right? And when they looked at the well-off schools, or schools that were already earning quite a bit of money or had enough funding, they didn't see much of an impact at all. It didn't really do much for them. If you hear the dog barking,
That's our dog.
yeah, he must
He's
have saw us.
upset about something.
Yeah, and so what this study really indicates is that.
Let me go check on him. We can cut this little break out.
Yeah.
I just need to go make sure nothing's out there. But. All right, I'm back. Our neighbors were leaving their driveway, and he thought that was unacceptable.
So just to kind of wrap up around where we spend our money as far as spending in poor districts, eliciting better, or rather more prominent results,
Right.
is what this indicates is that schools that already have sufficient funding in districts that have really high, or rather profitable property taxes, is that spending money where it's most needed is the most beneficial.
Right. Well, and to that point, one way you could interpret the results of the study is that increasing spending does help, but it helps some more than others. Depending on who you ask, though, more spending doesn't necessarily mean improvement. It really comes down to what you define as a success. Is it grades? Is it the facility? If you define success in terms of academic achievement, i.e., test scores and GPA and that kind of thing, then you're going to be sorely disappointed because money has very little significance over how well students do over their GPA. However, it should be noted, I think, that test scores, there we go. I'm sorry, I made myself. Okay. Where was I? It should also be noted that test scores do not significantly correlate with life outcome. So if you have a great GPA, that does not mean you're going to have a great job. It does not mean you're going to have a great life. Has absolutely nothing to do
Yeah,
with
and
that.
so that's this is one of the more important, uh, I guess, say points of our podcast here is looking at standardized test scores. And as you said, they don't really correlate. There is significant research that's been done to demonstrate that test scores, GPA, GRE scores, etc., don't necessarily translate to positive life outcomes,
Right.
nor does it correlate with a continuation of education. So if you do really well in your test score, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go to college or that you're going to pursue a master's degree or a doctorate degree.
Which is so messed up in itself, right? Because they put so much pressure on you in high school and in college about your grades and your GPA and how important it is to your life. I remember the last time I had an employer be like, well, you only got a 3.4 in college, so it doesn't look like I'm going to be able to hire you.
Yeah, yeah, and just to backtrack a little bit about using rather what the spending aspect involved with test scores and then your improvement of when you put money into a school is, especially when you put money into a poor school, you're not going to see much of a test score improvement or even an instructional improvement. And part of that is because in a lot of these poor district schools, they have so many operational problems. What I mean by that is like you have bathrooms that don't work. You have the heater that doesn't
Yeah, that one
work.
story was about
Yeah,
they got money and they had to use it to fix the heating.
yeah. You hear stories about like this, and you're like, how in the world does this ever happen? And it's not an overnight thing. These are problems that have been around for a while. We haven't really addressed education spending in a holistic way in a really long time.
Hmm.
And the longer we wait to actually make a change when it comes to education spending, the worse these problems get. And when they get worse, it costs more money just to get us back on track, let alone make a big improvement.
Hmm.
And so, back going to standardized testing, my bias, I have some really strong bias. I think standardized testing is absolute garbage to say the least. But let's before we just completely shit all over standardized testing, we kind of need to talk about what it's traditionally used for. And so standardized testing is supposed to be a measure of academic achievement, right?
Right.
Higher test score means you're a better student, or at least that's
Well,
the theory.
the ideal with test scores, right, is you got 100 on this test that in some magical world proves that you know all this information. Good job. Enjoy the next grade.
Well, and like we said, the frustrating part is that we know it's a really bad measure of student
Yeah, it's been
success and student
proven
achievement.
multiple times that it has absolutely no bearing.
Yeah, and the reason we still use it is because we just don't have a measure. Is the excuse?
Doing nothing is a lot easier than doing something.
Well,
That's why we still use it.
yeah, and there's a couple there's a lot of problems with this, and we'll talk about a few of them because from our research and what we've been talking about, and really just looking at what we can do to improve the educational system, getting rid of standardized testing might actually have some really profound impacts.
Hmm.
That is a very easy change to make. And to that note, we've actually seen some colleges take a step in the right direction here, or at least say they are.
Hmm.
So, what we've seen now is there's a lot of public universities that are allowing students not to submit test scores.
Yeah, you can opt
And
out of submitting your SAT scores.
yeah, and they also kind of posit that your test scores are more supplementary than anything else. They don't necessarily carry that much weight.
Right.
And those are all good things to do. But as long as it's still a standard for most colleges, and as long as high school is, for the most part, still perceived as being like a stepping stool to get to
Hmm.
college, high schools are still going to try and teach core curriculum around making students better at taking these tests. And now, of course, it is illegal for teachers to teach directly to the test, but that really doesn't stop that
I
from
didn't know
happening.
that.
Yeah, you're not.
It's illegal?
Yeah, you can't teach directly to that. You cannot in your classroom teach an entire class about how to take the SAT.
But that's literally what they're teaching you to do.
Well, not in public. You can't do it in public school. Not directly, but here's how parents circumvent that.
Okay.
So they hire test prep companies.
Okay.
So
Okay, so they can't train you to take the SAT
right,
in school, but they can train you to take the test that they're giving you in class. Does that make sense?
yeah,
Okay. So it's illegal to teach people how to take the SAT, but you can pay $150 to a tutor, and they'll teach you how to take the SAT.
Well, yeah, and I was that tutor for
I
a
know.
couple of years. Yeah,
That was you, babe.
and I needed the money at the time, but in reality, to some extent, I was, basically taking hundreds of dollars from parents to raise their students' test scores by, a marginal
You
amount.
said you felt like you were robbing them.
Yeah, I did kind of feel like I was robbing them. And the hard part is that when you're standing in front of a classroom full of kids whose parents are paying hundreds of dollars for them to be there and hundreds of dollars on some textbook that they could have
And then
found.
$100 to take the test.
Yeah, and then another $100 to take the test, right? And so they're spending all this money for a test. And so although we don't as a country spend much on standardized testing, meaning our tax dollars don't really go towards standardized testing that much, it's about 1.3 billion, which sounds like a lot, but when you put that in perspective of how much in total we spend on education spending, it's way less than 1%. So it's really not that much. But if you think about the cost to parents and what it ultimately ends up doing, so if you look on testing websites, for example, there's this they will like one of the first headlines is how reliable standardized testing is,
Mhm.
and that's very misleading to people that aren't fully informed as to what reliability means in statistics.
Right.
So in that case, reliability just means that every year that they uh, uh, require students to take this test, so take the SAT for example,
Mhm.
on average, the same amount of people score really low, the same amount of people score in the average, and the same amount of people score in the high end.
Okay.
What it doesn't mention is if it's a valid assessment of student achievement. So what that means is it's reliable, but is it reliably measuring what it's supposed to?
Right.
And many of the critics of standardized testing will say, well, no. And there's evidence to suggest that no, it doesn't actually equate to student success even by measures of other measures of student success.
Right.
It doesn't equate to a better GPA necessarily. There's a semi-strong correlation to SAT scores and high school GPA. There's a semi-strong correlation between SAT scores in your first year of college. But after that, there's almost nothing there. Mm-hmm. And so that's an important thing to recognize. And then you also, factor in how much parents are spending on it. And guess what? The kids that end up doing really well happen to be people of higher socioeconomic status, usually.
People that got money.
Well, yeah, if you can even break it down by subgroups, right? And so if you look at the ethnic subgroups test scores on the SAT, right, what you find is at the top is Asian Americans. In the middle and towards the semi-top is white Americans.
Shh. Hush.
Diesel has a lot of opinions.
He really hates it when we come in here because he can't come in here, and that just doesn't compute for him.
He heard education. He heard SAT scores, and he was like, "Only quacks do that."
Only quacks take SATs.
Yeah, so there's so many issues with it, and when you look at the ethnic distribution, it looks just on paper it looks discriminatory, right? Because you have Asian Americans and white Americans at the top, and then you have Black and Hispanic Americans at the very bottom, and that can tell you a couple things, right? So if you break it down by socioeconomic status and factor in those ethnicities, right, what it suggests is that the people that can afford test prep get it.
Yeah.
And the people that can afford private schools that can get away with teaching to the test get it. The people that can't don't tend to do so well.
Well, and that's not even taking into account the fact that the majority of school funding comes from property tax. And so if you live in a rich white neighborhood that has a lot of expensive properties that pay a good chunk of tax, all that money is going to making that school awesome. If you live in a neighborhood that is poorer and maybe has minorities in it and they're not able to, or they don't even have property, right? It may be instances where it's all rentals and they're not even paying property tax. The school's not getting very much money.
Yeah.
And all of their, lower socioeconomical children are going to the school that's not getting any money, and so sorry, no good education for you.
Yeah, and from that point, it's very easy to kind of see how this could snowball into a much bigger problem, especially for poor districts. Not just that they stay poor,
It's like
but
legal redlining.
yeah, yeah, it basically is. And what ends up happening in these poor districts, right, is if you think about it, right, if you build a lower quality infrastructure, so if you build a school building that's lower quality and you don't have the money to upkeep it, it's going to get worse and worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And since it was lower quality to begin with, it's going to break down faster, which means you
Mm-hmm.
have to spend more to upkeep it. And after a certain point in time, you're spending so much money just keeping the lights
It's
on
more
and
expensive to
keeping
keep it
the
on
roof
than it
over your
is to
head.
build another school.
Yeah, it's more or less, it's like when you have like a really old car, right? And then you go in to get it fixed, and then you realize, like, the problem with the car now is the engine. The engine is worth fixing. The engine is more expensive than actually replacing your car.
That happened to me.
Yeah, it happens.
Oh, there's a knock in your engine. Well, I guess I'm getting a new car then.
Yeah, when the value of a new engine is more expensive than the car itself, you have a problem.
That's what poor schools are.
That's what poor schools
So right, it's all about the starting point. You know, it's like, just to kind of recap what we just said. If you're born into poverty, you have less access to academic, social, and public health resources. And in contrast, if you're born into wealth, then you have way more resources to access education, not only nicer schools, but then also tutoring and test prep
are.
and, whatever your parents feel is worth, um, contributing to your education. Um, so one solution for schools is to provide some of the basic needs that students need to perform better in
Hmm.
schools. One of the things that is very prevalent and was definitely prevalent in my entire public school upbringing is free meal programs, right?
Right.
So kids, it is proven that kids do not perform as well when they are hungry. And if you come from a certain level of poverty, sometimes you don't have enough food, and then you go to public school. And so it's those programs are crucial. And I know they're always at risk, but feeding children is such an important part of making sure that they get their education and that they can process the information and grow and develop and maybe, overcome the poverty that they came from.
Yeah, and this just reiterates why when we spend more on education, it really needs to be funneled into these poor, lower socioeconomic status areas because they, by necessity, have to offer services that other public schools and particularly private schools and charter schools don't have to offer.
Right. There are very few kids on the free meal program in the rich white neighborhood. That's just the way
I
it
mean,
is.
that's just the reality of it,
Yeah.
right? And so they have to provide all these additional services that other schools don't. Well, you could argue that they don't have to provide those services, but then that also still has a negative impact on their educational
Mhm.
experience, which is why it is incorporated into the system to begin with. But providing those services is costly and expensive, and the worse those problems get, the more expensive those services become, especially
Mhm.
when you include the problems with the infrastructure of the schools, when you have like desks that are just breaking apart, right? You have all these just infrastructure problems on top of the fact that you have to provide all these additional services
Mhm.
if your students are going to have a fighting chance. And so it's not a fair world right now in the educational community. And when we spend money, we don't spend it in the ways that we necessarily need to. We don't put the money where it necessarily needs to go. And if you're going to get any federal help, you have to be spending just well below the national average on student spending. And so your school already has to be in the garbage can before the federal government will give you any kind of help with that.
You have to be failing. You have to be epically failing.
You have to have walls breaking down in order for the government to step in. It seems like,
Mhm.
and that's not necessarily the fault of the federal government on here.
No, of course not. We're not shitting on the federal government here.
We could argue that the federal government could spend more on education and
Less on other things.
bridge back some equality into the educational system. Uh, but you could argue that the culprit is more leaning towards property tax or
Well, just the system in general, right? The
yeah,
way that where the money comes from and how it's used is flawed.
yeah. And so we've kind of covered the general need to know about how education spending is done. It's far more complicated if you look even more into the district level spending or even school board budgets. But for the sake of time and trying to spend a little bit more time on just trying to get our ideas on how to fix these problems, and we're gonna transition to that.
We're just gonna
We were looking over there because we had a cat walk in.
hold on. What's he gonna do? You gonna come join? Can you go back outside now? Come here. Come here, Bubba. Come to me. All right. Yeah. No, that's fine. It's just annoy mom. That's good. Get over it. Get over it. Get over it.
So we've talked quite a bit about now where some of the gaping holes in the education system are, but let's talk a little bit more on the positive end.
Yay!
What can be done? What changes can be made? And how can we kind of fix this problem that we've ended up creating? And so it should be kind of noted first off that no change in the educational system is going to come overnight.
Absolutely not.
It is so complex. It's so huge that huge. It's so huge that making myself laugh now. It just can't be done overnight. There's no easy fix, right? So
well, and it's kind of like we were talking about earlier in regards to there were small things that were ignored for a really long time, and now they're huge things, and we need to address it.
Yeah, and so you can't just, spend a lot more money on poverty-stricken school districts and say, oh, well, problem's fixed now. No, it doesn't work that way. It's not going to fix the problem overnight, right? Because so much of that money is just going towards just getting the school back up in a running operational condition.
Right.
And then it's also not a solution to just monetarily incentivize parents to send their kids to private schools to circumvent all the problems that are going on in the public education system, right? Because private schools don't necessarily do you a whole lot more benefits and further increases the inequality gap, right? Because the people that can afford to send their kids to private school are going to, and the people that couldn't afford to send their kids to private school before the tax plan still aren't going to be able to send their kids to private
school. They still can't afford it.
Right? Just because it's tax-free money that they can save doesn't mean they have the money to save.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an important thing to mention, that these are just Band-Aids, if that, on a absolute horrendous gash in the education system.
Right.
And then to kind of point out the more inherent problems with the education system is that we haven't actually reevaluated what the standard curriculum looks like in decades.
I have a lot of opinions about this.
So I don't know about you guys, if you've ever looked back on your high school career. And
when's the last time you needed to know the hypotenuse of a triangle? Please tell me, in your adult life, have you ever needed to know the hypotenuse of a triangle?
Has it been pertinent to your survival and you thriving in today's world?
And I don't want to see any comments about people that work in very specific fields
where the Pythagorean theorem was super important to them.
Super duper for you. But for the rest of us, I've never used it. Not once. Nary one time.
On it.
But I was probably more than a month. It was so long. So long.
Right. So we haven't looked at the educational curriculum in a long time. And I don't know about you guys, but just to kind of bounce off that as well, is we're taught so much stuff, and about 95% of it in high school goes out the window.
It's useless.
And in college, maybe it's like 80% of it goes out the window, right? Because depending on what
depends on your program,
but a lot of it is general education, right? Like it's important, but ultimately, like so much of that just kind of gets goes in one ear and out the other.
Well, it makes me think of so my bachelor's is in theater, and I had to take a math credit, so I took math for non-majors, and it was just a waste of 50 minutes 3 times a week. Why did you? That teacher's wasting their time. I'm wasting my time. This is super.
Oh, if I had a dime for every class, but to be clear here, we're not saying that these particular courses are bad.
No.
Right. But when we look at the skills that we need, particularly the cognitive processing skills that we need in the real world, and then we look at how much of that we got from high school and college, mostly high school, it's minimal. Like, how many of you wish you knew how to file taxes by the time you went to
Or
college?
how credit worked. How many of you got screwed over by your first credit card because you weren't super sure how credit works?
Well, and the sad part is that it's not like a lot of these people can learn from their parents because their parents don't know either,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's not a super simple like everyone knows this. It's common knowledge thing. It's
Mm-mm.
really not. Uh, in money management, I'm sure that's one of the things
Accounting
that
and money management is
yeah,
like number one that we hear when we ask
yeah.
people.
And so we're putting kids through a curriculum where so much of it is just this knowledge base that you think you need to succeed in college, which in fact you don't necessarily all the time. And you're definitely not learning any practical skills that are going to make you marketable for a job.
It makes me think of that meme where it's like, elementary school teacher, it's going to be harder in middle school. Middle school teacher, you're not going to be ready for high school. High school teacher, they're not going to accept this behavior in college. College teacher, who wants Skittles? So what were you preparing us for?
Yeah, and so I guess what we're kind of suggesting here is that we need to reprioritize the educational curriculum in the
Absolutely.
sense of what do kids need to know coming out of middle school, high school, just K through 12 in general, and then college being more of this kind of specialized
Yeah.
thing, right? And that's not the case necessarily right now, but it's definitely something that we could work towards.
Yeah.
And so, in my personal opinions, this is where my bias comes in. I used to tutor a lot. I used to teach logic and statistics, so I definitely have some bias here. But I think cognitive reasoning skills. So being able to say, okay, what in order for a news outlet, for example, to draw a conclusion about something. So we'll give the example from another one of our podcasts here. So on one of our podcasts, we're going to be talking about the stigma against pit bulls, right?
Mhm.
And so
That's next week.
yeah, that's next week. Uh, but part of how that stigma came to be, right, was the media kind of popularizing the idea that pit bulls were dangerous. And so what ended up happening is people saw an article that said, pit bulls have the highest bite fatality rate of any other dog breed, right? And then by association, they draw the conclusion to say that all pit bulls are dangerous. And that's not a logically sound conclusion when less than 1% of all pit bulls
Harm someone.
harm somebody, and then to make the generalization or conclusion that all pit bulls are inherently dangerous. And so now that obviously a biased example on our end, but we make those generalizations all the time in politics. We make those generalizations all the time in social issues in general, right? You think about discussions around feminism or gun violence or racism. We make these generalizations all the time without
Yes.
having a logically sound conversation about it. We make generalizations from a snippet of information that we heard or saw.
We take a little snippet of information and then turn it into a nice, cozy blanket statement.
Yeah, blankets. Yeah, yeah, yeah. We do that all the time, and that's one of the reasons we want to do this podcast, right? Is that we didn't want to just make these blanket statements. We wanted to have an intellectual, but also a human to human conversation that where we don't just make these generalizations out of nowhere. We look at what the evidence says and let the evidence kind of drive the conversation, right? We can discuss and even debate maybe on what these conclusions mean we should do going forward,
Mm-hmm.
but we can't really argue about what the evidence says itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, well, that's something that I think should be absolutely a priority. Like, there should be a logic class in high school.
There's a
Like,
lot of classes I would propose for high school.
well, yeah, and you know what? You want to talk about writing papers? There is no better class for learning how to write a paper than a logic course,
Hmm.
right? Or a philosophy course
I
in
never
general.
took a logic class. I did take ethics course, but not a logic course.
Well, one of the like core components of writing a philosophy paper, or we'll just say philosophy paper, at least for me in college, and how most philosophy papers are written, is you kind of give like this roadmap. It's very similar to your standard like paper format, right? You have like your opening paragraph that's kind of like a roadmap for the rest of your paper,
Mm.
right? You state what your claim is, you give your supporting evidence to that claim, and then you give counter arguments to your claim.
Mm.
And when you present counter arguments, it is courtesy to present them in the best light possible, such that when you explain or describe your claim, it is logic proof,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's no way, or rather, it's very difficult to try and poke holes in it.
Mm-hmm.
And if we did the same thing, at least on a general level, when we had these types of conversations, we would get so much farther.
So much farther.
Where when someone disagrees with you, instead of just saying you're wrong, right, presenting their counter argument if it's a valid one, and most people do have valid points if you just have to find them.
You're so much nicer than I am.
Most people really do have valid points. They're very strongly opinionated about them and occasionally make false generalizations. But there's a snippet of a valid point in what they're saying,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we'll get to that a
No,
little,
I agree.
when it comes to education spending. But yeah, logic and information processing and research and the skills to look up when you don't know something, right?
We need to
That's
teach.
that's
We'll
so
get to that
important.
in a minute. I won't get into that right now. uh, but I do think that we should also emphasize technical
Oh
skills.
yes. Oh yeah.
So there's other countries um, that do this very well, and we do not do this very well. But teaching kids how to use computers from an early age, teaching them how to research, how to fact check, how to synthesize information from different sources.
Sorry, I was just thinking about how we should tell Congress this. I hope they're watching, so they can figure out how
Hey,
Facebook
if
works.
y'all could just Google how Facebook works and give that interview a round two, I think it would go much better. But yeah, and obviously we are seeing this a lot, and people get so mad about kids having tablets and screens in front of them. But I know 5-year-olds that can run an iPod better than a, 75-year-old.
Sure, shit better than a congressman.
Sure, should better than a congressman, yeah. But I think it's important that we teach kids, you know, the internet is an amazing, but also potentially dangerous tool. We need to teach them how to use it and how to understand that data and collate that data in a beneficial way to them.
Yeah, and especially when you consider that the future is going to be a technology age,
Yes.
right? Computers are becoming more and more pertinent to being able to succeed in life. If
Mm-hmm.
you can't work a computer in 10 years, you're going to have a really hard time finding any kind of job,
Good luck, yeah.
right? Or in 20 years, right? Computers and knowing how to work the internet and find information on the internet and then being able to verify whether or not information is correct is an absolutely essential skill.
Mm-hmm.
And we think we kind of like are indirectly teaching kids these skills, I think, in the curriculum that we have, right? Like, oh, you do your project and you have to use
Better
internet
cite your sources.
right? And you just kind of do, you're indirectly learning these things.
Mm-hmm.
And that confuses me because why don't we just have a class dedicated to knowing how to do the skill correctly as opposed to trying to learn some arbitrary knowledge using the skill?
Mm-hmm.
That makes sort of sense, right?
Well,
Like,
you could even teach a class on how to use that skill and say that the parameters of certain projects are like, okay, well, you write a paper on whatever you feel like writing a paper about, but you have to have, 3 verified sources for each fact or something like that.
well, how do you determine a verified source, Jordan? Right? Don't you wish you learned that in high school?
Yeah.
Right? But I'm joking partially, but like,
Dick.
but like this, I'm serious in the sense that like we talk about we kind of generally like give a 2-minute lesson on what a verifiable source is or what a good resource
Mm-hmm.
is on the internet when we don't actually look into the bias behind resources and the agenda behind resources. And we're not given the cognitive skill set prior to doing those projects to be able to decipher between what is a verifiable source slash unbiased source and what is a source with a clear agenda. What is it trying to persuade me of something? And we don't have a necessarily great way of doing that. And the sad part is for all those times that your teacher told you Wikipedia is not a good source, The reality is, it's a hell of a lot
Turns
more
out it's a good
verifiable
source.
than many of the other sources we've used,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it has so many different uh, sources
Well, the
cultivated
best thing
into it,
about a
and
Wikipedia page is scrolling to the bottom and seeing their sources
yeah,
and being like, look at all this information I just collected.
yeah, and don't get me wrong, just like with any source, not just Wikipedia, of course there can be inaccurate information or
Mm-hmm.
something that's not written correctly or grammar mistakes or whatever, right? You can have a problem with like that with any source. But the reality is Wikipedia actually does a better job than most sources. And for all those years we were told in high school what a terrible, terrible source Wikipedia was, I'm starting to wish I used it more. Right? I was a good student. I was like, oh no, I'm not going to use this source. I'm not going to be like these chumps that use Wikipedia to get all their information.
Liars.
Turns out they were a hell of a lot smarter than I were. I
Mm-hmm.
was. Clearly, I need to go back to high school.
Oh,
So,
Lord.
kind of to continue on with this conversation, though, when we're looking at education spending, time is absolutely money.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you're talking about education, whether you're talking about business, right?
And the more time we spend trying to improve the education system, the more it's going to cost.
Yeah, the more it's going to cost. And then another thing even worth looking at is the length of school days. Now, we haven't
Mm-hmm.
really gotten into this yet, but I know we both kind of have some opinions about this. And there's some evidence to kind of to support these claims as well. But uh, we put in so much time in an average school day
Mm-hmm.
to teach kids so much information, of which so much of it doesn't get retained.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of evidence out there to suggest that a school day starting at 8 a.m. is actually creating a disadvantage for a student, right?
Because young children need more sleep,
Mm-hmm.
right? So if you're waking them up super early to get to school and then having them, what is it, 8 to 3? So
If you're
that's
lucky.
7 hours.
Yeah, and then you have some schools that start at like 7:30, 7 o'clock. You have some kids
I
that
would have
show up at
flunked high school if
6.
it started at 7 a.m. Not a chance.
I mean, you just nap through your first class, right?
Yeah.
But no, it sets kids up for a disadvantage. And one thing that we, for whatever reason, haven't looked at because maybe it looks bad on paper to parents is shortening school days.
Shortening school days and getting rid of summer vacation.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. So some summer vacation that to a high school student that's tired of school looks really appealing.
Do you guys know why we have summer vacation?
Why do we have summer vacation?
It was started a long time ago when, in the summer months, kids needed time off to help their families run their farms and cultivate their crops. But I don't know about you guys. Uh, I don't know that many people run at home to cultivate a crop. There are some, and that's fine.
No,
But
man, they're running home to play on that PS4 for 24 hours straight,
the Xbox X,
right?
exactly.
And
So
they're not going there to, like, you're 16 years old, you're not going to back home to get it to over the
bring the
summer.
ox in. That's
You're not
not
bringing the
happening.
oxen, and most kids at 16 aren't getting jobs yet either, right? There's plenty of people that do, but the majority don't.
Well, even, you start high school, what, when you're 13 or 14?
Something like
Something
that.
like that. So 13, 14, 15, unless without parent consent in the state of North Carolina, you cannot get a job. So every summer vacation, you're just sitting there twiddling your thumbs and annoying your parents. There's no reason for you to have 2.5 months off school. Not when you can make school days shorter, get rid of summer vacation, and then have 2 week breaks several times throughout the year.
No, we haven't looked at it in a while, and it baffles me because you think about all the wasted dollars on
So much money.
a lot of it's redundant material too.
Well, and not even mentioning the teachers that have to get summer jobs to support themselves, right? We used to live with a teacher who was a raft guide in the summer because she couldn't afford to not get a paycheck for 2.5 months.
Well, another thing that she was having to do, and this kind of comes back to those some of the what the teachers in these teacher strikes are saying,
Mm-hmm.
is that one of the biggest complaints is teachers having to spend their own dollars on school supplies, right? And so for most schools, the tax credit is around $250, meaning teachers get about $250 a year to buy supplies for their students, right?
I don't know
And
if y'all have ever been to a craft store, but that's going to buy you about 3 things. It's expensive.
right? And then if you look at even just textbooks, right?
Oh
Because
God.
we were talking about this today, right? Is that textbooks are they're print media, right? And so
And the second they come
yeah,
off that press, they are outdated
yeah, they're
because it's
outdated,
print media.
right? And teachers will have to use them for years on end. I don't know if you guys heard about this, but in an Oklahoma public school, right, a kid got Blake Shelton's old
Textbook.
textbook, right? Like if that's the textbook you're using, imagine how many years behind you are on your reading.
When in reality, you could spend that money that you're using on textbooks because we all know how expensive textbooks are. Make an agreement with tech companies, say, all right, if you give us X amount of laptops at this price, then you can write that off on your corporate taxes. So now the school gets laptops that are good for anywhere 5 to 10 years, depending on the laptop, and the corporations that make the laptops get a tax break.
Yeah, you offer a tax credit to these corporations to donate computers. And from my personal experience, I think one of the biggest advantages I had growing up in my education was access to computers.
Mm-hmm.
At just about every level of education, past middle school, I had mostly untethered access to computers.
Mm-hmm.
In middle school, we were given laptops for my final year. I don't even know where they found. Oh, it was a private donation. That's what it was. Because this, I remember now because the school became a charter school,
Ah.
and some parent who was apparently had connections with the tech company got MacBooks
Hmm.
and was able to donate them all.
When I was in high school, we had 30 computers for all of the school. I think there was one other computer lab maybe that had 30 computers. So maybe 60 computers for 2,000 plus students. And you had to register a time for your class to go use the computer lab. And if somebody else had that time, you just weren't going to the computer lab that day. And that lesson or whatever was pushed off until the next day or the next week or whenever you could access the computer lab.
It's insane to me, and I almost feel like a little guilty because I feel like I had such an advantage to it as
I
far as
went to a
getting.
poor school, is what I'm saying.
I'll fully admit I went to private education for the majority of my education,
Mhm.
and the distinguishing character is because I can tell you up front, the teachers are no better than the ones you'll see in public school.
Mhm.
Uh,
Oh yeah, I'm not shitting. I had some amazing teachers in public school.
like I had, uh, maybe I shouldn't mention this particular teacher
Just
because
don't say their name. I think the name is
oh no,
inappropriate.
not the name, but just like because it's about this religious school that I went to, right? But like I had teachers, I went to a private Christian school for high school, right? I had teachers that were saying stuff like, you can't date, literally telling students, you can't date anyone who's non-Christian because they have too much baggage, right? And this is not a hate on Christian schools. What this is a problem with, or rather to illustrate, is that the quality of teachers is not necessarily that different depending on if you're in a private school or in a public school. Now, of course, there's going to be differences on just a school by school basis, but for the most part, there's no general difference between the
There's
two.
always going to be great teachers, and there's always going to be shitty
Yeah,
teachers.
and some of them are going to be in private schools, and some of them are going to be in public schools.
Mhm.
That's just the reality of it. So, now that we've talked about maybe some curriculum changes
Mhm.
and our disdain for standardized testing, let's talk about ways that we can increase spending on education. Because it is rather apparent right now that although we are in some cases wasting some of our education spending money, we also don't necessarily have enough of it to fix the problems that we've created.
Mhm.
And so, especially now with the new tax overhaul, this is a really important topic to mention. Is how do we pay for education? Where does that money come from? And what can states do to raise that
Right.
money? And this is important because these are usually policies that you vote on.
Exactly.
And so,
Also, if you have not voted in your midterm election, find out when it is. Find, not
find out.
find.
You want to find out?
Find out when it is and vote because midterms are just as important in presidential elections.
Yeah, and so
This PSA has been brought to you by me.
to just highlight real quick again that state budgets uh, across most states right now, 30 states, can't afford to sustain the public services that they're currently offering, which includes education. And for a lot of these states, particularly the ones where teacher strikes are happening,
Mm-hmm.
they've been
So does that Arizona,
Arizona, Kentucky, Colorado, uh, Air, let me tell you,
Colorado?
yeah, Colorado had some teacher strikes. Um, why am I forget West Virginia?
Okay.
Uh, but in a lot of these states, uh, they're now experiencing a problem where they can't find enough revenue to fund education, let alone anything
Yeah,
else.
it's not that they don't want to fix the problem, it's that they literally don't have the money.
Yeah, and to just also bring in the relevance of the tax plan again, even though again it's not the cause of most of these problems, but it also makes it a little bit harder on some of the states here when it comes to funding public education in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and what we saw already is that, like I mentioned, 30 states were already in a budget shortfall, right? 11 states had already started rolling out tax cuts prior to the GOP
Right.
tax overhaul, right? And in those states in particular, right, and if you and Oklahoma, Virginia, Arizona, Kentucky, all were prioritizing tax cuts prior to the GOP tax overhaul, and afterwards are still trying to cut taxes to make, and their logic in most of the cases being they don't want to double tax their citizens.
Mm-hmm.
But what they're seeing now is that their education spending is abysmal. And of those states I mentioned, I think I can't remember which states it was specifically that wasn't in the bottom six. But of about three of those states were in the bottom six when it comes to education spending
Right.
per student.
Yeah.
Uh, and
So where do we find money at?
yeah, and what you've seen in these states where they've been prioritizing tax cuts is teacher walkouts, teacher
Mm-hmm.
strikes. They don't have enough money, even though most people want to pay teachers well, right? But they don't have the money to. And I guess what you can say, maybe the benefit of the teacher strike is that it raises awareness about the issue, that we definitely need to restructure the way we pay for education, changing the funding for education from the property tax to something else, because
Well,
as
I mean, to that point, regardless of how you guys feel about marijuana, uh, the legalization of marijuana in Colorado has raised $150 million extra revenue, and that's going directly into their education and healthcare improvements. Now, obviously, in the most poorest districts, that's just a drop in the bucket to, it's slowly but surely changing.
it's been making a difference though.
Right, but nobody's complaining about that tax revenue. The tax revenue coming off of marijuana is helping people. That is
Mm-hmm.
very, very, very clear. So, just from an economic standpoint, if you need more money to help fund your healthcare and your schools and that kind of thing, how about legalize something that's never killed anybody?
Well, yeah, and particularly for states that have relied on the tobacco industry.
Right. Like, so I don't know if you guys know this. I don't think we mentioned it. We are in North Carolina. And North Carolina used to be the tobacco hotspot. We produced so much tobacco. But as we learned what cigarettes really did to you and the health problems that it caused, we seriously tanked a big part of our economy for a while. And we're slowly getting it back a little bit with furniture. But it is my belief that we can take the resources that we have and that we were using to run tobacco farms and turn them into marijuana farms and help supercharge the North Carolina economy.
Well, and it's also the case in Nevada. They had a
Right.
pretty strong tobacco industry as well. And when the tobacco industry tanked, so did the state budget.
Exactly.
And North Carolina is among the United States' worst states when it comes to per student spending.
I did not know
Yeah, fun fact.
that. Fun fact, we're super shitty. Isn't that awesome?
But it's not just Colorado that I mentioned,
Right.
because that's just one example of where legalizing marijuana has helped education.
Right.
It's also helped in California. California dwarfs Colorado when it comes to the money that they've made off of marijuana. They make $1 billion a year from just taxing
marijuana,
recreational marijuana.
So that's not even medical. That's recreational.
I don't know if that figure includes medical, but it might.
Okay.
I'd imagine it's probably just recreational,
Okay.
but I could be wrong.
Okay.
Oregon has used marijuana taxes to provide textbooks for low income school or poor district schools. DC raises almost $750 million a year, right, on marijuana and taxes.
Washington?
Yeah, you didn't know medical marijuana was legal there?
I did not.
Yeah,
I clearly need to do more research on
they make a
marijuana.
bunch of money off of it. And people migrate to these states or visit these states to purchase those products. And then they, like, never mind, I don't want to go that far. Probably going to mention someone I shouldn't. But people visit these states and they make money off of it.
Mhm.
And a lot of that money, the tax dollars from marijuana, goes straight into education for most of these states.
It just it's so mind blowing to me the treatment that people have towards marijuana.
I should probably clarify. We don't visit these states to buy marijuana.
Right.
That's not why we were laughing.
No, that's not why we were laughing. But this is something that we've researched in conjunction with the amount of revenue that can come from it. And it's so clear, like marijuana is safer than alcohol based on the research that people have done. And it can make so much money, but people are still like, oh, nope, it's the devil's grass. Can't touch that. It's just like, you're being ignorant.
Well, for whatever other, critiques you might have of marijuana, it does have a very clear benefit as far as state budgets are concerned, particularly providing for educational services.
Yep.
So, and the reason we mention legalizing marijuana is not necessarily because we have a bias, for legalizing it. It's because it's a very quick solution.
Well, and it's been proven recently, right, in the last 10 years, as people legalize it and then use that money.
Yeah,
it's a brand new way to make money for the government and for states.
It's a brand new way to make state revenue, and it's a very rather easy piece of legislation to start rolling out. Right? It's something that you don't necessarily have to restructure the entire education spending budget, right? Nope. You just find this very easy, right there in front of you source of revenue. Right, and I say easy in the sense of that it can be done a hell of a lot quicker than trying to restructure the entire educational curriculum and spending to try and correct those problems.
And guess what? If you legalize marijuana, the dispensaries will start popping up. The amount of effort that the state and federal government would have to do is so minimal.
Yeah.
Because entrepreneurs will jump all over that.
Yeah, and then the other solution that may not be so appealing to some people is realistically increasing taxes on higher earners and on large corporations. I don't know necessarily exact percentages or the best way to go about this, but the reason I bring this up is when you are talking about spending or finding money to spend on education, right? You can't take money if you take more money away from poor districts, or rather, if you tax poor districts more, right? Those districts are still going to stay poor,
right?
Right? They can't afford the additional taxes.
What is it that you said? The value of their dollar is more than someone that has a lot of money.
Yeah. So yes. So the value of a tax dollars to someone that is in a lower socioeconomic status is much higher than the value of tax dollars from someone that's a really high earner that's earning well above six figures or seven figures, right? And although it might not be a super popular option amongst high earners or corporations, the reality is that many of the larger corporations and very high earners can afford additional tax dollars or paying extra tax.
They may not like it, but they can afford it.
And the reason, again, we suggest this is that it's a solution of least harm. You're not taking away from the people that can't afford to have stuff taken from them.
Well, and specifically for education too, right? Because it's not like you're giving handouts or anything like that. You are helping fund the future of our country. That's what this is for.
Yes. And in contrast to this, because we've talked a lot about the state's perspective in the sense of where they're going to pull money from. But we haven't really talked about any of the concerns that a taxpayer might have, right? Because I've heard this a lot, and this is a very genuine and valid critique of the education system, is people don't want their tax dollars going towards a really crappy school.
Exactly.
In the sense that they don't want to pay for other people to get a crappy education. It doesn't make sense, right? You don't want your tax dollars going to something where someone's just going to misspend it. We have that problem with government spending all the time. That's why so many of us don't like paying taxes, right?
Hmm.
Because they don't give us a receipt on what they spend it on,
Right?
right? But to address those concerns, one of the biggest spending issues when it comes to education, and I say issue because we have a bunch of debt around this, is teacher pensions.
Mm.
This may not be very popular of a critique amongst teachers, but the reality is that teacher pensions amount to about $500 billion in debt across all the states.
What did you say? It was like for every hour they work, they're making $6.
It's about $6.70 towards their pension on average.
Right.
So to put that in perspective, that's about 3 times as much as the average American citizen.
Makes on their pension per hour.
Yeah. And so this is kind of confusing to me in a lot of ways of how this got set up because it seems like it almost seems like some con artist convinced teachers to do this, right? Where it's like, oh, how about this? We'll pay you less up front, but we'll pay you a heck of a lot more on the back end once you retire.
When you retire, you
So
shall have gold.
a bunch of promised money, right? And what that promised money has meant for a lot of states. You look in some of these states where teacher strikes are going on, and one of the pushback from lawmakers, especially GOP lawmakers that have this we'll say a perspective of fiscal responsibility,
Hmm.
right? That's a core kind of component to that ideology is
Right.
not spending money you don't have.
Right.
Uh, and there's nothing wrong with that. And what they found here is that they do that a lot with teacher pensions. They owe $500 billion collectively, all the states do, to teachers, and they're paying that off each year. And I think it was either West Virginia or Oklahoma where they were talking about this, where they had mentioned if they didn't constantly have to keep paying off teacher pensions, they could have raised teacher salaries by almost $10,000, right, over a 10-year period. Uh, so it's this counterbalance where you're not getting a whole lot of money as a teacher on the front end, but you're in theory getting a lot on the back end.
Right, but if you can't survive in your profession with the amount of money you're making, it doesn't matter how much money is going into your pension.
Well, and you can't take away from pensions now, right? Because now you've promised all this money. You can't just say, on second thought, we're not
This
going to
isn't a
offer this
bad
anymore.
idea.
We changed our mind. Sorry. But for the teachers that are still working, yeah, we'll pay you. We'll pay you
Most
money, right?
definitely,
Yeah.
don't worry about
Uh,
that.
but the reason we bring this up is this is an important component that needs to be addressed
Hmm.
because many lawmakers would argue that one of the biggest culprits for why teacher salaries haven't been increasing is the teacher pension, and it is drastically disproportionate to the average American citizen.
Hmm.
Now, we can say that teachers maybe deserve that pension, sure, that's fine. But again, coming back to reality, is if you take more money on your retirement pension, the government, the budget they use for education spending can't also accommodate for a higher salary most of the
Right.
time, unless they cut other programs. And so, what you end up seeing on school boards uh, uh, and education spending in general is the programs that get cut, the non-instructional ones.
Mm.
That's where that ratio came from of the 80 cents to every dollar spent on education goes towards teachers. Well, that's why, right? You can either get paid more up front, in which case everything, all your other programs suffer, or you can keep the pension you have and just stick with it.
Enjoy being in poverty until you retire.
Yeah, and so we really have to correct that part of it if we're gonna,
Hmm.
particularly for teachers' benefits too, right?
Right.
Because teachers get quite a few federal benefits and state benefits, but their salary isn't reflective of uh, maybe the cost of living.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
benefit they have amazing benefits, but I mean, the teachers work, they're barely paid above the poverty line, right? They make so little money that they take home. There's no way they can buy a house or raise children. You
they
know,
just have to retire first.
they just have to retire before they do any of those things. It's It's so counterintuitive.
Well, and states are going to kind of be forced in this unavoidable decision shortly if they can't find new sources of revenue, because they can't. Like I said before, 30 states don't have the money to pay through their budget for the 2017-2018 fiscal year, right?
Mm.
So where do you think they're going to take that money away from? Their teacher pensions, right? I mean, not to say that that's going to be their priority is to take away from teachers,
Right, but
but at some point they're going to have to stop spending money they don't have,
mm-hmm.
and they're going to look at teachers' pensions and say, well, it's 3 times higher than the average American. We could probably cut back on that, right? And so whether they want to or not, they might be faced with that decision regardless.
Mm-hmm.
And so, kind of wrapping up today's episode, what were like the key points, right? So, prioritizing spending in poor districts. That's
Mm-hmm.
where you see the most benefit. Uh, when you spend the money there, you get far better life outcome results than you would in a rich school. States need to find new sources of revenue. That's kind of the 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 theme,
Right.
right? Is that we don't spend enough on education. We waste a lot of the money we spend on education, and we don't have the money to continue to spend on education.
Right.
States need to figure out how we're going to spend or how we're going to get the money for that. And then changing up the curriculum.
Right.
We've talked about some of the more immediate short-term solutions of raising revenue, but then the more long game goals really should be just to alter our education system to be more reflective of the skills students need when they arrive not only in college but just the real world
As
coming
an
out of high
adult,
school.
how do you function as an adult?
Can you use a computer? Do you have enough reasoning skills to not fall into this fake news trap that so many of
Mm-hmm.
Americans do these days, to no fault of their own, more
Right.
fault to the education system. And education is so important. And that's why really we want to spend the time to talk about this topic, is that it truly is the great equalizer when it does its job,
When it's done correctly.
when it's done correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't always necessarily been in as much turmoil as it is right now. But because we had so many unaddressed problems, we haven't modernized the education system in so long, we haven't had a full length conversation about it. Those problems are just getting worse and worse and worse.
Yep.
And we have to address them. We have to.
Yep. Okay. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching the second episode of the POK Podcast. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to give us a like. We are going to aim to put out videos every Monday. So be sure to check back with us next week when we put out our video on how pit bulls became stigmatized and what that means for the breed.
And breed-specific legislation.
Yeah, breed-specific legislation. We'll also be talking about that next week. What do you think that we missed? Is there something that we didn't cover that you think is pertinent to education?
I would like to know, what is it you guys wish you learned when you were in high school?
Oh, that's a good question.
That you didn't learn when you were in high school.
Let us know what you learned in high school that you've never used. Just one. I know there's hundreds.
Oh, I was about to say, that's too long of a list. What is it you wish
What do you wish you would have learned in high school? Well, I guess we'll address the winner. Or we'll just do a quick highlights next episode where it's like, this is what you guys wanted to learn in high school that you didn't. All right, guys. Thank you so much. You're wonderful. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
See you next time.